Hello, welcome to GCSE RE revision. We're looking at the topic of euthanasia. We have a lot to get through, so let's get stuck right in. Euthanasia comes from the Greek meaning good death, and it refers to mercy killing, the idea that a doctor should be allowed to kill a patient or allow a patient to die to relieve the patient's suffering or to restore the patient's dignity in some way. So we can imagine a situation where I have gone into the store at the back of my room and thinking that I am having a nice cup of coffee, I have accidentally put rat poison in with my coffee beans and I have ground them up and I have poisoned myself in class. Being the conscientious class that you are, you rush me to hospital only to find out that this poisoning is too lethal, I've taken too much of a dose of rat poison and I will soon die a fairly horrible death. Now, the doctor then presents you with a number of choices. We can attempt to treat Mr. Veal and manage his pain. However, the doctor says he's likely to die and it's not going to be a pleasant death, so what do you guys want me to do? Now, you have a number of options here. You can go for active euthanasia. And in the case of active euthanasia, you would say to the doctor, listen, give him a lethal dose of some cocktail of drugs that will kill him quietly and peacefully. However, you've got another option. You can say to the doctor, could you treat him? And the doctor will say yes, but the treatment might not work. It's not going to be a pleasant treatment. And at the end of it, Mr. Veal will be alive. And you all know how miserable his life is having to teach his classes religious education. Do you really want the man to go on through life with RE classes? You think about it, you debate it, you realise that my life is meaningless and purposeless because nobody really listens to me, and therefore I would be better off dead. So you say to the doctor, don't treat him. Don't treat him because his life is purposeless and meaningless and fairly miserable, and he would be better off dead. And that would be a case of passive euthanasia. It's not treating a person because that person's life is considered no longer worth living. Now, you could ask my opinion, and if I were to say to the doctor, please do me in, I can't take my life anymore, that would be a case of voluntary euthanasia. A variation on that is physician-assisted suicide. Now, the difference between voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is in physician-assisted suicide, I would give myself the lethal dose. I would take the cocktail of drugs. But there really isn't much of a difference between the two, because although the doctor helps me commit suicide in physician-assisted suicide, and it's me taking the drugs, the doctor remains on standby. In physician-assisted suicide, for example, this would take place in Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland, the doctor needs to remain nearby in case the patient takes an allergic reaction to the drugs, or in case the patient tries to vomit the drugs back up and begins to choke, or the dose isn't killing the patient. The doctor needs to remain nearby to finish the patient off. So that would be a case of voluntary euthanasia, and so therefore there isn't that much of a difference between a physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. The British Medical Association would make this point. That's an association of doctors, and they would say, if you bring physician-assisted suicide in, you might as well bring in voluntary euthanasia. There really isn't that much of a distinction. In involuntary euthanasia, I might say, I know I've taken a dose of rat poison, but I'd like you to treat me, doctor. I quite enjoy my RE teaching. But you and the doctor decide that no matter what I think, my life really isn't worth living, best to let me die. That would be involuntary euthanasia. Slight variation on that is non-voluntary euthanasia. In non-voluntary euthanasia, what is happening is that the patient is unconscious or mentally incapacitated or too young to be able to make an informed decision, to be able to give their informed consent to treatment or to give their informed consent to euthanasia, and therefore the decision is made by someone else, and that's non-voluntary euthanasia. Now, one of the arguments against euthanasia would be that voluntary euthanasia, which seems to be about free choice, always becomes non-voluntary euthanasia at some stage. And the reason would be, is it seems manifestly unfair that adults who are suffering could get euthanasia, could insist that a doctor end their life, but a patient who is mentally disabled or a child would not have access to that option. Once society has decided that some people are better off dead, it then is unfair to exclude individuals because they are not old enough or aware enough to be able to make that decision for themselves. And so people would argue that there's a slippery slope, logically, from voluntary to non-voluntary euthanasia. And then the danger becomes involuntary euthanasia. And you could easily see that happening where the parents of a child say, listen, we do not want our child to die, and the doctor's insisting, we know better. We know better. We want to put this child down. So one of the chief arguments against euthanasia is that it will be a slippery slope and that there is no real difference between voluntary and non-voluntary euthanasia in practice, because one will always descend into the other. You're always going to have a situation where society will want people who are not old enough or who are not awake or aware enough to have access to euthanasia. Now, one thing we have to be very clear about here is the distinctions on passive euthanasia. There is a great difference between refusing to treat a patient because the treatment will not work, or because the patient does not want to be treated, and not treating a person because you think that person would be better off dead. So in passive euthanasia, what is happening is the doctor looks at a patient and says, I do not want to treat that patient because I want that patient to die. But there are situations where a doctor will look at a patient and will say, look, they're at the end of their life. I don't think treatment is going to work. I think treatment's going to be a real burden to that patient. I think it's going to be expensive. I think it's going to drag their life out unnecessarily and create unnecessary suffering. Therefore, I'm not going to treat that patient. And the distinction between the two is this. In passive euthanasia, the doctor decides not to treat someone, and the patient survives by some miracle, the doctor will be disappointed. In the other case, if the doctor decides not to treat someone because they think the treatment is unlikely to work or the treatment is going to create all sorts of unnecessary side effects, but the patient miraculously gets better, the doctor will be delighted. It's to do with what you're aiming at. So passive euthanasia is not switching off a life support machine. Because in that instance, if the doctor switches off a life support machine and the patient survives and begins breathing of their own accord, then the doctor will be delighted. But in a case where someone is practicing passive euthanasia, the doctor suggests, well, look, I'm not going to treat that person or that child because I believe that person would be better off dead given the extent of their disabilities or given the extent of their illness. I believe they're better off dead, so I'm not going to treat them because I want that person dead. And that's the distinction between the two. Now, the arguments for euthanasia are fairly simple. One revolves around choice. The idea is that patients should have autonomy. Patients should be free to choose their treatment. Patients should be free to say whether they live or die. They should have control over their own body. And the argument here is this is about human dignity. If we take choice away from people, we take their dignity away. There's also an argument for compassion, and that would be, well, there is needless suffering, which we can end with a simple injection. Wouldn't it be merciful to kill people to end needless suffering? So the argument would be that death is ending suffering and not life in that instance. And finally, people would say, look, this can be quite easily controlled. We can put in safeguards that will protect the disabled, that will protect people who feel that they're under threat from euthanasia. Now, the arguments against euthanasia are stronger than many people would imagine. Now, first of all, from a Christian point of view, every human being is made in God's image. So that's the first point you want to make. And that is, there is sanctity of life. Every human being is made in God's image and is therefore sacred. And that does not mean that a human life can never be taken. For example, in war or in capital punishment, historically Christians have said, well, there are instances where life can be taken. Some Christians have disagreed with that, of course, pacifists, for example, and said it's always wrong to kill. But where Christians are all agreed is that it is always wrong to take an innocent life. That is, it is always wrong to kill somebody who is not threatening you in any way or has not done anyone any harm. So if you're not punishing a person as in capital punishment, or if you're not trying to kill a combatant in a war, then we should not take human life. And that's the argument from the sanctity of life against euthanasia, that human beings are made in God's image, and that it's only in circumstances where a life is not an innocent life that that life can be taken. Where a human being is threatening your life in some way, taking a human life can be justified in terms of self-defense. But you cannot kill an innocent person. If we get rid of that rule, it's worth looking at the effects that this would have on medicine. First of all, some people might feel under pressure when they become terminally ill or when they become severely disabled to ask for euthanasia. We can think of people who might believe that they are a burden to their family. Or you can think of situations where families are waiting for someone to die so that they can collect their share of the inheritance. You can see situations where families might pressure people to take euthanasia. Or where society feels that certain people are drags on the state, that certain people are taking more than their fair share of tax dollars or pounds because this person has a disability or a disease which cannot be cured, and therefore pressuring people into voluntary euthanasia. So that's one effect that accepting euthanasia might have. Another effect is worth considering. Consider the power this gives courts and doctors. To receive euthanasia, you have to convince a doctor that you should receive euthanasia. So if somebody came into the doctor and said, look, I would like to be euthanized, I would like a mercy killing because I have bad acne, well, a doctor is going to put them out of the room. You're not going to accept that argument. But if somebody came in with a fairly serious case of paralysis or some sort of neurodegenerative disease, then the doctor might agree. But who's making the choice there? Ultimately, it's not really the patient, it's the doctor. It's the doctor or maybe the court that's going to decide whose life is and is not worth living. And where do we draw that line? How do we decide whose life really is worth persisting with? So there's a danger there that we give too much power to doctors. And doctors have said, well, look, this could undermine the public's trust in us. You know, we could have situations where patients are saying to us, what do you think, doctor? Should I be euthanized? Or where doctors are suggesting to people that maybe they would be better off dead. And that, a lot of doctors say, look, that's advice that we don't want to give because people might stop trusting us. People might be scared to come to us in case we advise them that they would be better off dead. Suppose we take the power off the doctor and put it back in the patient's hand. Well, at the minute, there's a man who is 104 who lives in Australia and he wants to go to Switzerland to die. There's nothing wrong with him. He has no terminal disease. He is not in any suffering. He just says 104 is old enough. I would like to die. And the Swiss clinic has said, yes, you can do that. Now, that is inherently dangerous because society has always said suicide is irrational and wrong. Now, if we get to the situation where we're going to say, well, suicide is okay in some cases, we are in a very dangerous place. So if we get rid of the sanctity of human life and we begin to say that some lives are not worth living, then we are in a dangerous place where everyone needs to worry that perhaps they will get ill and in some way cross the threshold where society considers their life is no longer worth persisting with. So the argument from the sanctity of life and the arguments against euthanasia say, yes, we can understand this call for mercy. We can understand this call to try and end needless suffering. But in doing that, we might place many more people in danger. Finally, we have to consider hospice care. Hospices were set up in the 1960s. The movement started by Dame Cicely Saunders, and they help people at the end of life with palliative care, which is pain relief. Palliative care deals with suffering and helping people move on past pain and psychological suffering, and helps people put their lives in order towards the end of their life. And hospices would argue that if we introduce euthanasia, that would undermine the hospice movement and undercut research into palliative care. So, as always, look at both sides of the issue, arguments for and against, come to a balanced conclusion, and remember to talk about Christian arguments when you're considering this topic. Bye now.